Welcome, everyone, to our new class called the Great Fall Wrap-Up. So I'm Dean Gunderson, the Director of Education here at Seed St. Louis, and I'm excited to talk about finishing up the year. So this class was kind of inspired by we've just had several people ask about, winterizing the garden or preparing the garden for winter or what to do or what not to do, all those different things. So this is kind of a grab bag class of all the different things that you need to do this time of year as we're kind of winding down. So this time of year, though, there is still a lot of life in the garden and a lot of harvest to be had. But how you end the garden season can help determine how much work spring will be for you, which is why it's good to, do it this way or, in a similar way, or at least it can reduce your workload in the spring, which is nice because spring is always pretty chaotic. Fall is a great time to improve your soil quality and create habitat for beneficial insects. And that's mostly what we're going to talk about is improving your soil and kind of getting your soil ready and prepped and amendments added and all those different things so that it's ready to go in the spring. So you're not frantically trying to do that during the 2 days that the weather and moisture is right to get stuff planted. So first we are going to talk about prepping overwintering crops, which is just something that you should be doing around now. And then we're going to talk about harvesting and cleanup in the garden, and then finally soil prep. So once everything's cleaned up, then how you prep the soil and kind of chuck everything in until you're ready to go again come next year. So first, overwintering crops. So any vegetable that will overwinter, you should weed it and mulch it. At least that's what we say. It's good to weed it this time of year because really after this point, you're not going to get a whole lot more aggressive type weeds. You will get some of the winter weeds, especially in more of the spring, like chickweed or henbit or dead nettle or things like that. But they're not very competitive. They're not hard to get rid of. But it's good to just clean up and make sure you've ripped out kind of, any bindweed, any grasses, anything like that is in those beds, and then mulch them. So when we're talking about mulch is any dead plant material. So straw and mulched leaves are really the ones that we like the best. And honestly, mulched leaves are really probably my favorite. But if you don't have those, you can't get them, straw, you can go buy straw usually somewhere. So that's another option. And this is just a picture here of garlic and then some bok choy, which is not going to overwinter, but shows you in terms of the mulching. So, no soil. You can't see the soil at all. So nice thick layer of leaves on here. And that's going to help retain moisture over the winter when we have dry spells, as we are increasingly having in the winter. And it's also going to help reduce temperature fluctuations in the soil because, again, when we get these kind of warm spells and then really fast drops in temperature and stuff like that, having that kind of insulation layer on the soil can make the temperature extremes not quite as high, which is less stressful to the plants. And of course, helps prevent weeds as long as you weeded before you put the mulch down. Crops that you want to overwinter that are not naturally overwintering crops. So this excludes garlic, shallots, potato onions, walking onions, and elephant garlic. Anything that you're wanting to overwinter that isn't those, you will need to cover if you want to overwinter them. So if you're wanting to harvest, spinach in January, you are probably going to want to cover it, unless you're just hoping that we'll have a really mild winter and we'll be okay if that's not true and it dies. But the things on this list will naturally overwinter without protection. Everything else, if you're wanting to overwinter at all, you will need protection. Low tunnels are probably the easiest. And if you want to learn more specifics about how to do that or how to, do low tunnels and do those different things, we cover all of that in our winter gardening class, which is up on YouTube. So then the last harvest. So if you have cool season crops, we still have a month or more of time that you can enjoy those crops and harvest from them, and they will be just fine because your cool season crops can take frosts. They will die when the temperatures get low enough. How low depends on the plant, which again we cover in our overwintering class and our winter gardening class. But warm season crops will die at the first frost. So that's what kind of distinguishes warm and cool season crops. Warm season crops cannot take a frost, so they will die at the first frost, which could literally be any time now. Like we are in the window that, a frost, it would not be crazy for a frost to happen tonight. I mean, that's not going to happen. But just keep an eye on the forecast, because it'll be within the next probably 3 weeks that we will get a frost. And when that frost is coming, you will want to make sure that you harvest all of your warm season stuff before that frost comes, if you're wanting to salvage that. So before a frost comes this time of year, again, keep an eye on it. Before a frost comes, you are going to want to harvest all of your warm season crops. So that's, everything here: your sweet potatoes, your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplant, your basil, beans, squash, pumpkin, zucchini, cucumber, melon, sweet corn. All of those things will die when you get a frost. So you want to go out, harvest those things, store them, share them, whatever you want to do. But if you wait until a frost, they will turn to mush and be really gross. So don't do that. But a few things that maybe you don't think about in terms of harvesting are sweet potato leaves is one that I really love. The leaves of sweet potato vines are edible and nutritious and pretty good, especially for a green. Like, it's a pretty mild, tender green. And especially like when you cook it, it's very mild. It's a very pleasant flavor. And so, as we're approaching the frost, start harvesting those leaves. At this point, you're not really going to hurt the sweet potato. You can harvest them, eat them up. And then as you're ripping out the vines, which you need to do to get to the roots a lot of times, as these students are doing here, pulling all the vines back so you can see where the roots are, save some of those leaves, eat them. They're pretty good. But also green tomatoes, green peppers, and green squash are also things that are valuable to save and not just let go to waste. And we'll talk about kind of how to ripen those, what to do with those in the next couple slides. But another thing, sticking with sweet potatoes, is when you harvest your sweet potatoes, if you didn't know, it's best to cure them. And that's just the name of a process. So this is a process of preparing sweet potatoes for storage. And basically what it does is it just allows them to dry a little bit and for their skin to toughen. So when you first dig a sweet potato, the skin is very thin and very fragile. And if you leave it like that, it's easy for it to get scrapes, for the skin to get rubbed off, knocked off, and then they're gonna go bad faster. They're gonna dry out, they're gonna rot. Something, one of those two things is going to happen, and they're not going to be very good. But if you cure them, they're going to store for much longer, and they taste better. The curing process also converts some of the starches to sugar and gives sweet potatoes more of their sweet flavor, is actually the curing process. So if you dig up a sweet potato fresh and you cook it, it's probably not going to taste like what you think a sweet potato tastes like. It's going to be much more starchy. And it's not a hard process. Basically, all you're doing is you're laying them out somewhere warm with lots of airflow for about a week, maybe 2 weeks, and just laying them out, like this. You don't want them stacked on top of each other in a bin or something, like single layer laid out. And that's going to give them time to dry, like for any dirt or anything that's still on them to dry, because you do not want to wash them. You don't want to use water to wash them. So you let it dry. The airflow helps that to happen. The warmth helps that to happen, and that skin is going to thicken up. And then once that happens, you can kind of rub off the dirt, like just the big clumps and stuff of dirt. But again, don't wash them. Once you wash root crops, that limits their storage life. There's various theories, but for whatever reason, it is pretty well accepted. When you wash them, it limits their storage life. And so you don't want to wash them, but once it is dry, you can kind of rub off any of the big clumps of dirt and leave them pretty clean. And then once that has happened, once the skin has thickened up and everything, that's where you can then, stack them a little bit more, stick them in a bin, store them somewhere dark, cool, and eat them as you want throughout the fall and winter. And then tomatoes. So everybody loves tomatoes. But tomatoes don't know that winter's coming. They're from the rainforest. Winter's not a thing where they come from. And so, even though it's cool, a frost could be tomorrow, it's still going to be spending its energy flowering. So there will always be green tomatoes when a frost is coming. All green tomatoes can be eaten as is. If there's a recipe that you like for green tomatoes, pick them and eat them. So, a frost is coming, pick those green tomatoes, because if the frost comes, you leave them outside, they're going to freeze, they're going to turn to mush, they're not going to be edible. But, pick them, eat them as is. If, you're stripping the plant and the fruit is full sized and is ripe, obviously pick it. Or if it's partially ripe, pick it. Or even if it's full size but still very green, pick those. And those can usually all be ripened inside. So you can take those inside, set them upside down. So like the stem side, so like this side down. Put them somewhere in a single layer, kind of like showed with the sweet potatoes, not stacked like this. Put them in a single layer, kind of upside down in a warm, sunny place, ideally. Like if you've got, a sunny room that doesn't get really cold at night or something. But like a sunny room, sunny window, something. Sit them there, and most of them will ripen, and then you'll have tomatoes for another couple weeks because they'll ripen kind of over time, which is always nice. But you can also just eat them green. Again, any tomato that is not full-sized, so, on these, like maybe this one up here is full-size, so that one would probably ripen. But like these little guys, those are not going to ripen. But those are the ones where it's really like, okay, I'm going to try and ripen these, but what am I going to do with these green ones? That's where the green tomato recipes come in. And there are so many of them. Fried green tomatoes is usually what people say when you're like, you can eat green tomatoes. And they're like, oh yeah, fried green tomatoes. It's like, yes, you can do that. But there's also so many other recipes. There's green tomato salsa, which is kind of like a salsa verde and pretty good. There's green tomato relish, which tastes exactly just like relish. I mean, just the same thing, basically. And there's just lots of other recipes that you can find for green tomatoes online in cookbooks. There's, people have had green tomatoes for as long as they've had tomatoes, and there's a lot of recipes out there. And so don't let them go to waste. And again, it extends your harvest. You can cook those, you can eat them, you can store them. If you're making relish and salsa, those are relatively easy to can, to put in the fridge, to freeze, whatever you want to do. And then peppers. So just like the tomatoes, all green peppers can be eaten as is. A green pepper, like when people buy a green bell pepper, it's just an unripe pepper. That's all it is. There are not special green peppers. So all green peppers can be eaten as is, no matter the size, doesn't matter. If it's a hot pepper, obviously it's going to be hot. But for sweet peppers, they're all going to taste, like a sweet bell pepper. And if they are not full-sized when a frost is imminent, that's what you should do with them. You should eat them as green peppers because they're not going to ripen. But like tomatoes, if they are full size, most of them can be ripened. The way that you do it with peppers, though, is a little different. You can you leave them on the plant and you just rip the whole plant out of the ground. Just uproot the whole thing and then hang those somewhere inside, or at least somewhere away from frost. I've done it a couple times, like in a spare room or in my basement or something. And you hang them, and a shocking number of them will ripen. And they ripen over several weeks. So even, after a freeze, you can be getting, fresh, homegrown, ripe peppers for a couple weeks, even into the winter time, or, fall, winter, whatever you want to call it at that point. And then squash. So same thing. All green squash can be eaten like summer squash, because that's what summer squash is. Summer squash is just unripe squash. The ones, that we're growing specifically for summer squash, we've bred for that purpose. And so, they usually are a little better, or they, will hang out unripe for a lot longer than normal winter squash. But, if you have any, patty pans or zucchini, obviously, eat them. But if you have winter squash, and if you've got butternut, if you've got acorn squash, if you've got spaghetti squash, if you've got pumpkins, and they're still like very green, you can eat those. They're gonna taste kind of like zucchini. So you can just like cut them up, cook them just like you would summer squash. But you can also, if you end up with a lot, you can also like shred them and freeze them to then later bake with them for like zucchini bread or something like that kind of throughout the winter. It can also, and this sounds like a lot of work, but I've done it sometimes when I've had a lot of green squash left over. You can kind of slice them up, dehydrate them, and then grind them into a powder, like with a blender, food processor, coffee grinder, depending on kind of what size you chopped them up to. And that powder it's like an instant mashed potatoes. And I usually mix it in with mashed potatoes. It kind of like makes the mashed potatoes lighter. And it's really good that way. And then just like the peppers and the tomatoes, if they are green but full sized, well, if they're full sized but not fully ripe, they will probably ripen. If they're green and full sized, oftentimes they will also ripen full sized. And the way that you would do that is kind of like tomatoes. You just bring the green squash inside, put them in a warm area in a single layer, ideally, and quite a few of them will ripen. But how successful that is depends on which squash you're doing. So if you're working with Cucurbita moschata squash varieties, so those are things like butternut squash, Seminole pumpkins, tromboncino pumpkins, a lot of the more like buff colored pumpkin, not the like bright orange, but like kind of the more like buff colored like orange pumpkins or like dark blue pumpkins that are kind of more short and fat. Those are Cucurbita moschata usually. Those ripen really well. Varieties of that Cucurbita moschata. And if you're not sure if your squash is a Cucurbita moschata, look up the variety name, and usually you'll be able to find if it's a Cucurbita pepo, and that C pepo. So Cucurbita is what the C stands for, but a lot of times people will put the C period pepo to see whether it's a pepo or a moschata. There's also mixta and maxima, like there's several different species, but the two main ones are pepo and moschata. Moschata ripen really well. So if you're growing something like butternut, Seminole pumpkin, and tromboncino, and you have green ones, bring them inside. I one year had, it was 2 Seminole pumpkin plants, and they went crazy and produced 80 pumpkins, but there was only like 3 of those 80 that were fully mature when the frost came. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with 77 green pumpkins? And I brought them inside, and a lot of them that were like really dark green and not full size, I was like shredding, I was freezing, I was making zucchini bread, I dried a bunch, but I like couldn't get to them. I was like slowly going through them, and I realized that a bunch of them, like as I was working through them, instead of rotting, they were just ripening. And like a good probably 50 of those 80 ripened before I was able to process them. So the Cucurbita moschata ripen really well. Cucurbita pepo squash, so those are things like acorn squash, spaghetti squash, and most of the pumpkins that people think about in terms of baking pumpkins and carving pumpkins. This does not work as well for it. It'll work sometime, especially if it's like partially ripe. A lot of times they will ripen the rest of the way, but if they're not ripe at all, they usually won't ripen. But definitely give it a shot. It's always worth a try. So then you've harvested your stuff. Now it's time to clean up. So the first thing is just to remove all dead vegetable plants and weeds from your beds. So like live weeds, clear your beds of weeds. Your dead frozen tomato vines and okra towers and all the dead stuff. Remove it. You can either pull them up or cut them at the roots, kind of whichever makes sense. Trying to uproot sunflower stalk is just like, why? I mean, it's just not really worth it in the fall. But some things, if you're trying to uproot, or you're ripping out your kale, which you would do, later in the year. A lot of times I feel like when I try and like move kale to cut it, it just pops out of the ground anyways. Like they just have little tiny roots. And so you don't need to like try real hard for one or the other usually, unless the thing that you're working with had like an awful disease. If you've got a plant that's got some awful disease, probably try and uproot it, pull it out, so that those roots that potentially are diseased aren't sitting in the soil. But generally speaking, I wouldn't stress about it too much. Anything that you're ripping up, at least in my opinion, can be added to your compost, except you do not want to add any plant that is diseased. If you've got a tomato plant that's got like awful blight all over it, yeah, don't throw that into your compost bin. If you have plants with major pest infestations, yeah, don't throw that into your bin. If you've got a squash there and it's just like absolutely crawling with squash bugs, yeah, don't add that to your compost. Put that in a pile and burn it, in my opinion. Or throw it in the trash or something. Like, get rid of the bugs. And then don't add any of the weeds that are like aggressive weeds with rhizomes. So like, don't be throwing your, Bermuda grass roots or bindweed seeds or anything like that. Like don't throw those into your pile. Now some people are like, oh, don't throw anything with seeds in it at all. And like, you can definitely do that. But like for me, I don't think chickweed is that big of a problem. And so if chickweed has seeds on it, I'm going to throw it in my compost because it's just not that hard to weed. But if there's weeds that are difficult to manage, yeah, don't throw those if they have something that it can regrow from into your compost bin. But you'll hear some people that are like, never throw any tomatoes in or never throw any of this plant in or something like that. And at least in my experience, unless that plant has like a noticeable problem, like you're like, this plant is sick, this plant has a major pest infestation, I don't see that. I have not seen harm in adding those things to my compost. Again, unless there's a real problem. And then, yes, I don't add it to my compost. Another one that is not directly like in the vegetable garden would be your native perennials. So hopefully you've got at least some native perennials around to support the native pollinators, but also beneficial insects that are going to help to eat and parasitize the pests of your plants. They generally need our native perennials to support their populations when those pests that you hope they're eating are not around. Like when there's not, cabbage worms to eat, they are living on pollen and nectar from native perennials. And we talk about that in our pest and disease management class. But assuming you have those, and hopefully you do, if not, check out our class and plant some because they're great. They are not only vital during the growing season, like it's not just the flowers that are important, but they are also really important in the winter, it turns out. A lot of these insects will overwinter or lay eggs in the stems of these plants. A lot of these stems, if you have any native perennials, you will notice when you cut them, a lot of them are hollow. And these bees, you can see this one here, a lot of these like bees and other insects will go into those stems and like overwinter in those stems directly, or will lay eggs, and those eggs will overwinter in the stems, or the eggs will hatch and overwinter as pupa or whatever. But that's critical overwintering habitat that you want to protect so that in the spring they are already there. They don't need to come back and find your garden. They are already there, so that if a pest shows up, there's already something there to eat it, so that hopefully that pest doesn't get established and out of control and eating all of your plants. So what a lot of people have been told, and what a lot of people tell me, is that then what people are now recommending is you don't want to cut down your natives in the fall, and you cut them down in the spring instead, like in April. The problem with that is it turns out that a lot of these insects have not hatched by April. Many or have not, become their adult form and emerged in April. If there's pupa overwintering in the stems, a lot of times they might not be coming out until summer, at which point it's kind of too late to cut them back. And so what do you do? So what it turns out, and this is information from the Xerces Society, which is a really great organization about supporting insect populations. And what they have found, and what they recommend, is actually in the fall to trim your native perennials back. So don't cut them all the way down, but trim them back from about 12 inches, 12 to 18 inches. If the plant's only 12 inches, you need to cut it down a little shorter. But cut them down in the fall, leaving those 12 to 18-inch stumps, and then just leave those stumps forever, basically, because they will break down and they'll fall down eventually. And so what that kind of looks like, in the winter, you've got these, or you can wait until spring if you are, if you're able to do that. Waiting till spring is great, and then you can kind of cut it back to that 12 to 18-inch. And then because you've cut it back, but not all the way, you still have those stems available for the insect use, but also the new growth is going to cover all those stems. So it's not going to be like there's a bunch of dead stuff mixed in with your flowers. You don't even really see them because the new growth is taller than what you have left. And then those stems will stay there, but eventually they're going to kind of break down by probably the end of the next growing season. And then you just repeat the process over again. And so you're still trimming it, so it's still obvious to people who maybe don't like that look that it is being managed. You are tidying it up a little bit if that's a concern in the fall for whatever you're doing. But if you're able to leave the full thing until the spring, that's helpful for birds as well, because then that gives more access to the seed heads and things like that. And then in April, cut them back to that 12 to 18-inch height, and then leave that throughout the growing season. And that's really helpful to our native wildlife. And then leaves is another important thing that's been getting a lot more attention recently. So leaves also, naturally, before we were, raking and mulching them and stuff like that, they would lay on the ground. Like that's where the leaves ended up. They'd lay on the ground and they'd slowly decompose. And so leaves also became an overwintering habitat for a lot of insects. So if you are removing all of the leaves, you are removing that overwintering habitat for those insects. But, if you have a lawn and you leave the leaves on there, it will kill the grass eventually. That's partially the purpose of leaves, is to smother the grass because the trees don't like grass. But you probably have somewhere in your yard, a perennial bed with, ornamental or native flowers. Or something like that. So if you are raking or mulching or moving the leaves from your grass, it's best to then not remove them from everywhere, but to leave them as a mulch somewhere. And the insects then have somewhere that they can overwinter. So you can kind of rake them in and around your kind of other plantings if you have that area that you don't need to clear to keep the grass alive. Or if you are mulching your leaves, that is a phenomenal mulch for your vegetable garden. Well, really a mulch for everything, but really great for your vegetable garden. And also add that to your vegetable garden, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. So those leaves, again, are another important habitat, but that doesn't mean you need to just like let your leaves go and your yard, just like half die and turned into something like that. If you want to do that, cool. As long as it's legal, I don't care. But you don't have to do that. You can still have a nice, conventionally, aesthetically pleasing lawn and still support those populations by raking and moving them to specific areas that you're going to mulch with, wood chips anyways. Instead of doing wood chips, do the leaves that you have for free and that are also going to be supporting those native insect populations. So then once you have cleaned up the area, it then goes to prep work. So this is the stuff where a lot of time, a lot of people will do the cleanup and stuff like that, and then they kind of stop there and they leave the soil prep for the spring because you prep it right before you do it. But there's also soil prep that you can do now, and it has quite a few benefits if you're able to do it now. Fall is a great time to improve your soil and prepare it for a bountiful harvest next year, because you can allow a lot of things will kind of work out in the wash. You've got several months time for the freeze thaw process, for worms, for roly-polies, for all of these different decomposers and stuff, to do things with your soil if you kind of set the stage for that to happen. And there are really kind of three key steps to improving your soil and prepping it, and that is amend, aerate, and cover. So amend is, this is just a great time of year to add any amendments that you need for your soil. So in fall, again, doing it in fall allows it time to incorporate into the soil and do its thing before spring planting. So what I'm talking about with this is if you did a soil test and you find out I have no magnesium, which like would be unheard of, but like you have no magnesium or something like that, then this is a great time to add a magnesium fertilizer or something. Because it's then you're then going to have, months for that magnesium fertilizer to kind of work its way into the soil with rain and worms and, all the different natural processes. Or if you had a soil test, or you've just, that I want to grow blueberries and my soil's too high or something. If you need to adjust your soil pH in any way, this is really the time to do that. Because again, adjusting it with these amendments, it often takes time for those amendments to work. So sulfur, for example, if you need to lower your soil's pH, which you would know by doing a soil test, if you needed to lower your soil's pH for whatever reason, and you apply sulfur, like it says right on the bag, if you get it, that like you need to apply like 6 months before you want the soil to be that. And so if you're like, I'm going to plant blueberries in the spring, I'll add sulfur in the spring. Well, you could do that, but the blueberries are going to be very sad for the first 6 months because the sulfur is going to take that long to actually lower the soil pH. Versus if you apply it now, you then have, probably about 6 months before you'd be planting your blueberries in the spring. And so this is a great time to add those things just because it gives time for all of that to work in. Or if you're going to apply, kelp meal or, just any of the natural kind of fertilizers, amendments that you would do to kind of build mineral content in the soil, now's a good time to do it. And it's also a good time to add compost. If you're going to add compost to your beds, it's usually a good idea to add 1 or 2 inches of compost to your beds at least every couple years, just because the natural turning and, mixing and breaking disturbance of the soil that you get through annual vegetable cultivation does lead to the breakdown of organic matter in the soil. So adding more through compost, this is a good time to do that. And you just add it to the top. So, yeah, I think I talk about it later, but just in case I don't. So yeah, you can just add it to the top. You do not need to till it in, especially if you're adding it in the fall, because worms and stuff will come and till it in for you. They're the natural tillers of the soil, and they will do it without killing all of the fungus and bacteria and worms, which is what happens with tillers. So then aerating your soil. So this is a great time to aerate your soil in order to break up any compaction that you might have in your soil. This is particularly helpful if you added amendments to the surface, as it allows them to more quickly penetrate into the soil surface. But this does not mean tillage. I mean, if you want to use a tiller, do what you want to do. It's your garden. But what we recommend are things like broad forks, digging forks, which is what this picture is, or shovels are the best way to break up compaction. The tiller, first of all, only gets maybe 6 inches deep. Like it doesn't break up that much compaction. But also because it's literally like, they're not like real sharp like blades, but like blades that are spinning and like chopping and dicing the soil. Again, they are breaking up any soil clumps, which are actually, clumps are a good thing, not clods, but like little clumps. It's also slicing and dicing any beneficial fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, worms, anything that's alive in the soil except bacteria, it's going to churn and slice up. Whereas broad forks and digging forks or shovels, where you're just sticking it into the ground and then kind of leaning back, so not like picking it up and flipping it, but just like leaning back where you're kind of lifting and cracking the soil, that is breaking up compaction, and it's breaking up compaction much deeper, usually closer to a foot deep. But it is also doing it without doing all of that destruction to the beneficial soil life. And then once you do that, just with a hard rake, kind of rake the soil surface, which will allow any amendments that you had added to the top to kind of fall into those cracks that you made through aeration, and also to just smooth the surface out. And by spring, the surface will be very smooth. And then cover it. So once you have kind of amended your soil, once you've aerated it, you want to then cover the soil so that just the sun and everything doesn't break down the compost and you just lose a lot of it, which is a thing that happens when it's exposed to the sun. But also so that, if we get a lot of rain in the winter, it doesn't, cause a lot of erosion or, just all the different things that can happen. Mulch protects the soil surface and it insulates the soil, which again reduces big temperature swings. And by preventing big temperature swings and keeping a more moderate soil temperature, you are also promoting decomposers. So again, these are things like worms and roly-polies and things like that that are good at breaking down the mulch itself, but also any other, roots that are left in the soil from maybe some vegetable plants or anything else like that. And literally tilling. Worms do like a thing where they'll when it's cold, they go deeper into the soil to stay warm, and then as it warms up, they will come back up where they like to feed. They like to feed more at the soil surface because that's where the organic matter is, and they are eating the bacteria that are eating the organic matter. That's where their nutrients are coming from. So they come up to the top, they're munching on bacteria and stuff like that up at the top, and then nighttime comes, it starts getting colder, and they dive down deeper into the soil where they do what? They poop. And so they're moving this organic matter from the top down. And these kind of daily circular motions that they do up and down are first digging tunnels. So they're creating aeration themselves, but also churning and mixing the soil and basically tilling that compost or any other amendments that you had into the soil profile without, again, having to kill the beneficial soil organisms. And kind of last but not least would just be cover crop. So and we talked more about cover crop in, I think in our winter gardening class, where we gave like more of the specifics about like planting and killing it and all those different things. But if you are wanting to do overwintering cover crops, this is the time to plant them, like this weekend or the weekend after. So these are things like winter rye, which is also called cereal rye, vetch, crimson clover, annual rye is actually usually overwinters now. It still says it doesn't, but it usually does, at least if you're in kind of the urban area. And so this is the time to plant those in the St. Louis area, so that they have enough time to get growing before the day length gets too short, and they just kind of stop, and then they hang out as just little plants for the rest of the winter. There is no special treatment needed to winterize overwintering cover crops. They are naturally overwintering, so it's like your garlic, your shallots, your elephant garlic, all those different things. But unlike garlic and shallots and all that, you do not need to mulch them. You're planting them densely enough that mulching them would be way too complicated. So you don't need to mulch them. They are kind of themselves the mulch because they're planted pretty close. And then last but not least, enjoy winter. It's, a much deserved break for gardeners. You made it through. We're almost there. And that is the great fall wrap up. I hope that was helpful.